This is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get writers to shut up. Tonight, we have with us the self-branded tattooed theologian, Dillon Naber Cruz. So, first off, what are some of your tattoos? You're wearing like a long sleeve. I can't see them. I was expecting like a neck tattoo or something. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, no, I don't have any neck tattoos, but I do have 13 tattoos, and most of them are pretty personal to me. I have one regrettable kind of flash tattoo from where I grew up in Texas, but most of the rest of them are pretty unique to me. Some that I designed myself and got artists to do. Yeah, so I mean,
So when you say personal, too personal to talk about, or just they have personal meaning to you?
Just they're personal to me in that I either designed them, they're meaningful to me in some way. I have grace period tattooed on my wrist, on my right wrist, and then I have charis, which is Koine Greek for grace, on the left wrist. That's kind of if I'm in church and I've taken communion and they hand me the bread, that I'm looking down at both of those to know kind of what I'm receiving in that moment.
Okay.
And then some of them are a little bit out there because I'm a little bit out there. Not your typical theological tattoo, probably. So
Okay.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love the idea of tattoo. I don't have any tattoos right now. I'd love to get some someday. And I love them as a form of self-expression, but then also kind of like a reminder of things in your life, whether past or perhaps future goals. I really do like that. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What do you like to do?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I grew up. I was born in Kansas City, but grew up primarily in North Texas. And I joined the Marine Corps from there, and I don't recommend that. So I did that. You don't have to. And I'm kind of all over the map. I like art and literature. I'm also a big sports guy. I've lived in 13 different states and a couple different countries, so that all impacts my worldview and kind of broadens my worldview. I'm also a nature and permaculture guy. My first book was about permaculture and the golden rule, and permaculture is an ecological design science. So I'm an eclectic person, I guess, and a little weird. I'm super nerdy. I'm gonna cry every time I watch Return of the King when he says, "My friends, you bow to no one." Well, just forget it. Dylan's gonna cry right there, right? It doesn't matter how many times I see it. So yeah, nerdy, sporty nature, and then also the history and theology academic background. So humanities all the way for me, pretty much.
Yeah, I'm more of a charge on the Pelennor Fields guy myself, but that is a good line still. But you bring up an interesting point about being somewhat eclectic, I think, as you put it. I think a lot of artsy people, creative people, we have this desire inside of us to get what's inside of us out, so we can like commune with other people who are perhaps the same as us because we haven't felt that connection with other people in our life. So I do see this common theme of, hey, we're all kind of weird and eccentric, and we want to find other people who are just like us amongst the writing community.
Oh yeah. What's my tribe? And I think in one of my essays, even I mentioned it's in volume 1 though, I think, or maybe it's even in my first book. I mentioned that like clothes can be the marker of a tribe. I grew up in North Texas where we wore dinner plate belt buckles and giant hats on our heads, and cowboy boots, and that kind of, you knew where I was from if you saw me. Even when I lived in Honolulu, I dressed like, so, or sports memorabilia, or my T-shirts with Charles Dickens on them. I'm the only person I know that has more than one Charles Dickens T-shirt.
You might be the only person I've ever met that has one. So.
Yeah, Dickens is my favorite author. I absolutely love the way that man used the English language and described scenes around London, and then did social commentary with his literary works. So yeah, that makes total sense to me.
So you mentioned a little bit about your worldview, and I think we'll get into that in a minute here. But what's your background and perhaps worldview that's led you to what you're writing in your essays?
Okay, so I grew up in two very conservative, white, almost exclusively white Christian denominations, the Church of Christ and the Southern Baptist Church. And those things, those two theological worldviews, in some ways similar, in some ways very different, definitely shaped my upbringing, my formative years, and my academic background, both in history and then later when I studied religion, theology, and biblical studies in grad school, kind of picked that apart in a way that it does for a lot of people. And my first wife was a Southern Baptist fundamentalist. She was an Army chaplain, and when she was already a chaplain, I was starting my undergraduate studies. And when I started my undergraduate studies, some of the things that I thought I knew growing up fundamentalist started to unravel pretty quickly. And she kept, she said to me one day, well, it's going to be okay. You're going to come out of this with your faith intact. This happens to a lot of people. She thinks I'm Satan now. So it didn't come out intact. I didn't, I wasn't able to maintain those beliefs because I found them to be intellectually, spiritually, and in a lot of ways morally bankrupt. And I know that that will probably come as a shock to some people, who might have a theological bent. But also studying history really as an academic discipline, not just going and buying the latest, popular history book at the Barnes and Noble or whatever, but studying history academically and learning how historians do the work that they do and how critical thinking works. That all shaped me as I matriculated through academia, and then sort of deconstructed, left the fundamentalist church more than 2 decades ago, and then started to deconstruct from there. Didn't go back to a church for like 15 years or a dozen years, really, until I started to academically deconstruct. And I'm still walking that line. Like sometimes I go to church and sometimes I don't, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And I think faith is a conversation now, and it's not a certainty, the way that the way it was taught to me growing up.
So you've mentioned deconstruction a few times.
Yeah.
What would you say is your viewpoint right now in this particular moment? I understand it's kind of an evolution of your viewpoints over time, and you believe different things now than you will in 10 years. But where are you at right now?
I like to say that, yes, I am a theologian, but I also like to say fuck a lot. I hope that's okay with your listeners.
It's completely fine with me, at least.
I'm considered kind of a heterodox theologian because I don't necessarily align with everything within Orthodox Christianity. And as my New Testament professor said, we all have a canon within the canon. In other words, we all, people who read the Bible and find it as a source of spiritual nourishment, or, who are practicing Christians, they will leverage certain parts of the texts in that anthology of dozens of books, right? And my canon within the canon has, for over 20 years, been love your neighbor as yourself and the golden rule. And the reason that is because if you read the text, the 4 gospel texts, that's what Jesus himself said was the most important. And we have globally like 40,000 different Christian denominations. And in America, we have like 4,000. So, and because I've studied, biblical studies and church history and all that kind of thing, I know that we don't have any original text and all that stuff. So trying to nail down exactly what is the right belief is something that Christians have been arguing for over 2,000 years. But there are some very clear things in the anthology that we call the Bible that make a lot of sense. Take care of the people who are less fortunate than you are. Welcome the immigrants and the stranger. Feed and clothe the hungry. Give them food, shelter, and follow the golden rule. and literally my whole first book is about how you follow the golden rule through the lens of the ethics of permaculture, which is creation care, uh, future care, and neighbor care. So all of that gets me called a heretic quite a bit, because I'm a public theologian. I engage online as a theologian, and a lot of people think that when I put theologian by my name, that means that I believe a certain, prescribed list of things, and it just isn't true. And I try to push back on that some. Um, and then, it freaks out the squares a little bit sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to your point, going back to the message of Jesus, perhaps for a second here, he did very clearly state what the greatest commandment was, and that
Yes.
all the laws and the prophets hang on that. And so when people come to me, and this is my personal view, and I'm not a theologian, so maybe I'll get a little attacked for this, but when people come to me and say, this person's a sinner or this person's a sinner, I'm like, well, what truly is sin? Let's look at what sin is through the lens of what Jesus commanded us, which is to love God and love others.
Right.
And if you're looking at through that lens, all of a sudden things that are or are not sin may become a little bit clearer.
Yeah. Yeah. And, growing up in the two traditions that I grew up in, sin management was a big part of it. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, don't go with the girls who do, kind of thing. And don't have premarital sex, and don't this and don't that, and all of that. And I don't think that that's a very effective way to be, or to think about faith. And if we're thinking about how we can help other people, and certainly Jesus was concerned about the kingdom of God in the here and now, and he was also concerned about what was going to happen at the end of the age. And spoiler alert, he thought it was going to end like 2,000 years ago. So he wasn't exactly right on that score, and neither was Paul. And so that leaves me with, okay, so right belief and sin management really isn't the thing. And we may not ever figure it out, because the chances of us finding an original manuscript are pretty slim. So, and even if we did, we might not figure it out. But we can love our neighbors, or we can love as I have loved, as he said in John 13:34. That's how people will know that you're my disciples. And so I lean on that, and that's that gets me in trouble. I've I've had people invite me to leave the country because of my views of history and theology, and stuff like that, because for them it's so rigid, and they, even if they know the text well, they get hung up on dogma instead of what's in the text.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, there you could have two people who read the exact same text and come away with two very different things from it. And I think
Absolutely.
I've realized that there is no one in this world that believes the same things about God that I do. And
Right.
that goes the same for you, and the same that goes for everybody else in this world. Everybody has their own belief and perception of what God is, what spirituality is, and how it pertains to them in their life, and everything, and how it's all interconnected. And if you expect that only people who believe the same thing that you are going to go to heaven, or whatever you believe about heaven, you're going to be the only person there.
Yeah. Yeah. The Church of Christ tradition was particularly egregious at that. I knew a pastor that got fired for telling the following joke: a Baptist and a Catholic are in heaven, and they see a Church of Christ guy walk by and go, shh, he thinks he's the only one here. And the pastor at that Church of Christ church got fired for telling that joke. Wow. Because they really do believe that they're going to be the only ones there. And I don't find that in the text anywhere, to be honest. I just never seen that in there. It's kind of a spiritual hubris and one-upmanship that I don't think Jesus was really talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And I do want to come back to some of this a little bit later, but your book, I'm assuming it's just called Theological Musings Volume 2. Is that correct?
Theological Musings, Collected Essays of a Tattooed Theologian, Volume 2.
I stand corrected. So yeah, you have this blurb here. It says, is a collection of theological essays covering contemporary social, political, and ecological topics. These essays are written through a progressive theological and permaculture informed lens. So, what do you think is the political climate in the US right now, prior to and now in the wake of the recent election?
Well, because my academic background is in history, I tend to read articles and books, by historical scholars. And the moment that we're in now, according to John Paxton, is it John Paxton or Richard Paxton? I'm always getting him. Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism. We are about to enter stage 4 in that, and what he lays out as what fascism is. So we are in a precarious moment where there are literal fascists who have taken the reins of government. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that with hyperbole. I say that with fear and trembling, because I've read William Shire's The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich, and I understand what that looks like, at least a little bit. And I've read Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism and seen where the kind of rhetoric and the actions that the incoming president have taken. And Paxton said in 2021, he said, he hesitated to call Trump a fascist for the first several years of his, running for president and then being president. And he said, but January 6th changed that for him. He has to call him a fascist now. So that's the historical reality. And it's frightening, and it's dangerous, and it's unfortunate, and it makes my book really incredibly relevant, because I both volumes, but the most recently released one that came out on election day is really pertinent because of the rhetoric, particularly around immigrants and the LGBTQ plus community, and people of color, all the hullabaloo about CRT, critical race theory, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of that is the language of authoritarianism. The kinds of things that you hear from people like Peter Hegseth, who is an avowed Christian nationalist and who may become the next Secretary of Defense, which is horrifying. I'm also a Marine Corps veteran, so the fact that he's a veteran doesn't make him qualified to run the Secretary of Defense any more than the fact that I'm a disabled veteran makes me qualified to run the Veterans Administration, right? I don't have that kind of management experience just because I get a check from the VA because I got mangled when I was in the Marine Corps. So that's the kind of moment that we're in. And that's why the work of historians and sociologists like Andrew White and is it Peter Seidel, and theologians across the board who are not Christian nationalists. And that's the other piece of that too. Hegseth's not the only Christian nationalist that Trump has tapped up. And the Project 2025 document, the Mandate for Leadership, has numerous people in it who are aligned with Christian nationalism. And the Project Blitz playbook with Lance Wallnau and the New Apostolic Reformation, and Mike Johnson is part of that. So we have a Speaker of the House who's a Christian nationalist, and they've all got Trump's ear. And it doesn't take much to get him to do something. All you got to do is flatter him a little bit, and then he'll go along with it because he's getting his attaboys, and that's what his malignant narcissism needs, according to a lot of psychologists. That if you look to Duty to Warn was an account that I used to follow that was run by a bunch of psychologists that were like looking at him and going, "Hey, this is crazy. We can't be doing this." So that's the kind of moment that we're in. And I wish I hadn't had to say any of that.
Yeah. Um, Here is my opinion about Christianity and Christian nationalism.
Okay.
I think even if you are a Christian, you should not be for Christian nationalism.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. 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 The case against Christian nationalism is this dude named Jesus.
Yeah. And this comes from my, don't judge me too much, but my perhaps libertarian views,
Okay.
which I believe that everyone should, what's the saying? It's like, I believe that a gay couple should be able to defend their pot farm with AR-15s, that kind of thing. It's,
Sure.
Everyone do your own thing as long as you're not treading on other people, right? And Christian nationalism just goes against that. And even if you believe everything that this government perhaps is going to force on everyone, the fact that the government is intervening and forcing it on people should go against that ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are essays about Christian nationalism in the book, and I talk about it a lot on John Fugelsang's show on Sirius XM, Progress, on Wednesday nights, and on our podcast, the God Squad Pod. And the thing about any Christian who seriously, all you really have to do is sit down and read one of four Gospels. And I would recommend the Synoptics. So read either Mark, Matthew, or Luke. Just start at the first page and read it to the end of that particular book. And then try to find anywhere where it looks like Christian nationalism is a thing that Jesus is espousing. And you will not find it.
Yeah.
You absolutely will not. In fact, Jesus says, we don't try to force our beliefs on people. If you go to a town and you give the message and they don't want to hear it, shake the dust off and go to the next town. And in the narrative, particularly in Matthew, Jesus is out in the desert for 40 days and he's weak and tired and hungry, and Satan takes him to the top of the highest mountain. And he's like, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you bow down and worship me. And he's like, nah, that's not my gig. So if it's not Jesus's gig, why are we trying to force that on people? And the other thing that I absolutely loathe about it is that it's anti-intellectual horseshit. It is just, as a person who has studied history academically, it's mind-blowing how many people believe this myth that people like David Barton or Lance Wallnau push on the American people, that America was founded as a Christian nation. At the Constitutional Convention, they wouldn't even allow chaplains in the room when they were writing the Constitution. I think it was Ben Franklin who said, hey, should we have prayer before? And everybody's like, nope, that's not what we're doing here. So, they cherry pick stuff, they take it out of context, or they just literally make stuff up. And that drives me batty. It just does.
So we've now briefly discussed the political climate. What do you think about the religious climate in the U.S.? Because that's also a large topic of your book.
Yeah, that's the scary part, because more and more people are being influenced by Christian nationalist ideas and ideology, and they may not even know it, but those folks are really good at networking and marketing their message. And if you have a population of people who have not been taught to think critically, who have been taught that expertise is something to be shunted to the side, and that historians are lying to you, then it's really hard to break through to folks like that, because they're not going to be able to hear you, even if you give them solid historical data, right? So, and then on the flip side of that is that so many people have left the church because of these kind of views, whether it's the bigotry towards the rainbow family, as I call them, the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's brazen white supremacy. And the denomination that I was a part of, the Southern Baptist Church, was founded by the enslaving class, who believed that white people were superior and that black people liked being slaves because we were telling them about Jesus, and that was a fair trade. So you have this weird dichotomy where lots of people are leaving the church and becoming more secularized. And then yet there's this growing Christian nationalist movement. There's a really good book called Taking America Back for God that's written by two sociologists that I highly recommend. And you could see this sort of battle of wills almost. And then caught in the middle somewhere are churches who are trying to be faithful to Jesus, who take the Bible seriously without taking it literally, and who believe very ardently in the separation of church and state. And the reason that we have that amendment is because the founding fathers, as they are so called, knew their European history. They knew how many wars and how much death and destruction was caused by religious strife and state-sponsored religion. And they didn't want that here. And so now you have people like Ryan Walters, who's using taxpayer money in Oklahoma to buy $60 Trump Bibles that cost about $2.12 to make because they've got the Constitution and all this other nonsense in them. Well, that's idolatry right there. I mean, you shouldn't be putting secular documents in that text, in that collection of texts to begin with. So the religious situation in America is precarious because there are some people who, even if they believe and want to go to church, they're not going anymore because the Christian nationalist and what I call, and this is a fancy theological term, so I apologize in advance for using it, fundamentalist fuckwittery. And it's a set of beliefs, actions, and behaviors that fundamentalists engage in that go against common sense, go against what the text actually says, and it's anti-intellectual nonsense. And it's oftentimes uses the Bible as a weapon, which I don't see anywhere in the New Testament, certainly. I know far less about the Hebrew Bible, but in the New Testament, certainly, I do not see it anywhere where it says use our faith as a weapon of coercion and forced conversion.
Yeah. You know, putting aside all of the, let's just call it policy beliefs of the Republican Party for right now, I think what they, and let's even say Christianity as a whole, which hopefully we can change, is missing right now is empathy. I think a lot of the things that the Democratic Party is pushing for is empathy towards the less privileged. Yeah. And again, this is putting aside all the positives and negatives of the policy that each party's pushing. That's what I'm talking about. But people on the left are looking for empathy and people on the right aren't giving it to them, which is, it's not what Christianity is about too. And also, I find it strange that Trump has become this figurehead for Christianity with all of his moral failings.
Yeah, that's super much a mystery to me. And the fact that he's not terribly compelling as a speaker. And back when he was first running in 2015, when it was pretty clear that he was just trying to boost his brand or whatever, and then he just kept getting those shots of dopamine from all the people who were lauding him for reasons I can't fathom. But I've often said that what is happening is that there's this mutually toxic symbiosis happening between the very conservative Christian right and somebody like Trump. So for them, he's going to kind of rubber stamp the things that they believe in as public policy, even though he doesn't believe in them. And for him, he's going to get our great leader kind of, pump Trump up kind of thing. And that's where we're at. And it doesn't make any sense. If you listen to a man who literally goes to the bathroom on a golden toilet and compare him to Jesus, who says it would be easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than a rich man to get into heaven. Or as David Bentley Hart said, the New Testament sees wealth accumulation as an intrinsic evil. And Trump is like, the thing about me is I'm greedy and I'm rich. Well,
Yeah.
these two things do not, it's like oil and water. They do not mix, but somehow the Mike Johnsons of the world are trying to shake up this bottle of oil and vinegar and make it, do things that chemical reactions don't typically do.
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming in your book of essays, you have how we get out of this mess written in there somewhere.
I don't have an essay that says, here's the prescription for getting us out of this hellhole. But if you look at my writings in total, you would see a lot of themes emerging about how that could happen. And one of them is to love our neighbors as ourselves and to enact the golden rule in the best way that we can. And a major way of doing that is taking care of the only habitable planet that we have. Because I don't think it's a fair trade to say use a certain kind of dishwashing detergent because my dishes will be shiny, but then the watershed downstream from me is going to be polluted because I'm putting chemicals in the water. So if we start taking care of not only our backyards, but also our downstream neighbors, then we can get closer to that kingdom of God kind of dynamic that Jesus is talking about. We have to also educate ourselves. We've never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States the way they did in South Africa post-apartheid. We never had a reconciliation with our 400 years of enslaving African descended peoples. We still have people in the United States, very prominent people, claiming that systemic racism doesn't exist. And we still have Confederate monuments. Well, I've been to Germany. I did not see one single monument to any Nazis. And I didn't hear any German people saying, well, how come there's not a Himmler statue over here? How am I supposed to learn about history? Right. So we have to start telling the truth about how we got here. And only by telling the truth about how we got here can we fix it. So in those kind of ways, there are some prescriptive things in my books that would help. And that's one of the reasons why I often say that orthopraxy is more important than orthodoxy, because you can look in the Protestant canon, there are 66 books, and there are some very clear instructions in those 66 books about how we treat people. There's some really esoteric stuff and some stuff that's really hard to understand. But taking care of of your immigrant neighbors, go see Matthew 25, 31 through 46 on what Jesus said, how you take care of welcoming the stranger, feeding and clothing and giving water and shelter and going to visit the prisoners and all of those kinds of things. And even the Apostle Paul, who often gets a bad rap because there are books attributed to him that he didn't actually write, he had some very egalitarian views about flipping the hierarchy of gender roles so it didn't matter anymore. So all of those kinds of things, I think that if people of faith took them seriously, would help a lot. But I personally don't care if people are atheists. There are compelling arguments for atheism. I absolutely get that. It's not a conclusion I come to because of my own lived experience. But even atheists have something like the golden rule. Even the satanic church has the golden rule. So if we just meet people where they're at, hear their lived experience, and try to be as loving and kind to them and not push back on somebody whose gender expression is different than mine, or whose sexuality is different than mine, or whose immigrant status is different than mine, then we'll be doing a lot better. And some people say, that's kind of humanism. And sure, yeah. And I think that Jesus certainly wouldn't have called himself a humanist because that category didn't exist and it would be anachronistic. But if you look at the golden rule and the love of neighbor and taking care of the marginalized, those are all kind of humanistic concerns.
Yeah. All very well said. How does permaculture relate to all this? That's the third part of all your essays.
Yeah. Well, I first became aware of permaculture back in 2006 and took my first permaculture class in 2007, then took a teacher training for it, and then an advanced design practicum through Oregon State. And then I realized that if you look at the ethics of permaculture, they look a lot like the Golden Rule. And when I started thinking about the Golden Rule, I remembered, hey, that's my canon within the canon. So eventually, I couldn't see theologically without looking through the lens of permaculture. And permaculture seeks to design systems that will provide fuel, food, and fiber that are regenerative. They're not just sustainable, but they actually regenerate. And if we look at agriculture in the United States, it used to be that almost everybody knew somebody who worked on a farm, right? And now less than 2% of the American population works on farms. And a lot of those people that do are undocumented workers. I have farmed, I have ranched, I have chased cattle, I have been shit on, I've been kicked, I've been hit in the butt by a bull. I've done all that stuff. It's hard work. But the way that we're doing it is detrimental to the ecology of the biosphere. So we have to look at that through the lens of love of neighbor, in my opinion. And so I can't, like I said, I can't distinguish theology without the permaculture lens. The joke, and there are a couple jokes in permaculture. One is, what less can I do? Because if you design the system well, you will have less repetitive, redundant work and less waste. And the other joke is that when people learn about permaculture, they're kind of like that giant golden retriever who jumps into the pool at the party and then runs up to all the guests and shakes all the water off because they're just so excited and have to tell everybody about it. And that's kind of how I can get sometimes when it comes to that. And there are a lot of ways in which permaculture and permaculture practitioners seek to build community with other like-minded people, that tribe thing again, right? People who care about where the food comes from, people who care about the ecology of the region that they live in, the bioregion that they live in. I live in the lower Susquehanna watershed, and at the bottom of that watershed is the Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the most amazing estuaries in America, but it's highly polluted because the Susquehanna is so polluted. And the Susquehanna River is 4.5 billion years old. It's one of the oldest moving bodies of water on the planet. It was there when all the continents were one, Pangaea. So it's an ancient, ancient river, and humanity has completely messed it up. If we start reversing some of those things, that will help. But it takes top down and bottom up. And if you have a president who says, well, I just don't think that global warming is real, well, then, hey, you shouldn't be running for president. This is not asking if you believe in Santa Claus, man. This is science, right? I don't believe gravity's real. Well, let me know when you float into space, right? It just doesn't make sense. So you've got to have both, and that can be really demanding in a culture and in a world where we're all exhausted because of all of the stuff that's going on to get people to try to be more involved. It's really difficult.
Where's a great resource to start for if someone's just like, I want to learn enough to get going myself? Where should they go?
Well, honestly, you can go to YouTube and put permaculture in, and you will get lots of hits. But if you look for a guy named Geoff Lawton, and he spells Jeff the Geoff way, there's lots of videos that he does. He is a permaculturist from Australia. He actually taught with the guy who founded the whole thing. And he's done some fantastic work in really arid environments, greening the desert. But there's my book, Go Golden, has a primer on permaculture. It's available from Amazon or from the publisher Whip and Stock. There are, at Oregon State, there's a guy named Andrew Millison. He was one of my teachers for 2 of my classes. He teaches through the Oregon State University. And if you've got some money and want to like really learn it, I would absolutely recommend Andrew.
Okay, awesome. So, final question. What's your goal with this compilation of essays? Is it just to outline for people who are curious what you believe, or is it to help you inform, to help work through your own beliefs, or are you trying to actually enact some change in your readers? What are you trying to do here?
Oh, I'm absolutely trying to enact change. 100%. I am not trying to convert people who are not Christians to Christianity. That's not my jam. I don't believe in evangelism as such, because there's a lot of things that go with colonialism and white supremacy that go along with that. And as I said, we just don't know. We're not going to pin down exactly the right thing to believe. And pretty much everybody's heard of Jesus anyway, right? But if you're a person who has grown up Christian or are curious about theology, or you are currently Christian and you're just like, some of the stuff doesn't make sense to me, then those essays can help unpack some of that stuff. There's some essays in the 2nd volume that just came out that show the kind of work that theologians and biblical scholars do in academic settings. I included those for a reason, so that they don't just go, well, where is he getting this wackadoodle nonsense, right? But you don't even have to be Christian to read them and to be informed by them. It can help people to understand that we shouldn't conflate white evangelical Christianity as all Christians, right? And that's something that I see a lot happening on social media, that people who are not Christian think that, everybody believes that certain thing. Every Christian believes that gays are going to fry in hell. No, they literally do not. The best preacher I ever heard in my life was flamboyantly gay. The dean of my seminary was his husband. So that kind of thing. And with the permaculture stuff, that's a whole new way of seeing. It is complete. There's an essay in my book, a denunciation of anti-LGBTQIA bigotry through a permaculture lens, in which I use permaculture to show that diversity is the norm and that we should pick apart and utterly destroy homophobia and transphobia. You don't have to be a theologian to understand that. or to think that way, right? That's more of a permaculture thing, but it is theologically infused as well. So yeah, I'm a public theologian, and that means that I'm trying to take theology out of the classroom or the pulpit and down to the street. That's why I interact as much as I do on social media. It's why I do Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang, and people around the country can hear that. And it's why I do the God Squad pod with my co-host December Rose, who is a former pastor. Because there's a better way. And there are a lot of Christians that are out there floating around the ether, so to speak, going, I don't know where I belong anymore. I want to go to church. I don't know where I belong. And I can help point them in a direction if that's the way they want to go. But if they don't want to go to church ever again, I can also point them in another direction.
Awesome. Any final comments before I let you go?
Volume 2 is more relevant than ever, and I hope that relevancy pushes it into the hands of the people who need to read it. And I just about broke even on Volume 1. A lot of people think that being an author is this super lucrative thing, and well, he's on the radio, he's on podcasts, and I about broke even. So with paying editors and all the things that one has to do to write a book and get it published by a publisher, it's a lot of hard work, and sometimes those things cost money. So, but it's relevant and timely, and I hope that people will be positively impacted by reading it.
Awesome. Everybody, support your local creatives. We have Dillon, Naber, Cruz.